Ashish, you can start. Your audio is not connected.
Morning, everyone here in India and our colleagues from Australia as well. I welcome all of our participants to Australia Virtual Masterclass Series for CBSE school leaders, and I'm very thankful to Dr. Biswajit Saha, Director Training at CBSE, for supporting this initiative. I also welcome our Australian speakers for today, Dr. Kate Thompson, Dr. Christopher Blundell, and Ms. Simone White, and our other colleagues from Queensland University of Technology, and acknowledge my colleague Neha, who has helped setting up this masterclass. My name is Ashish Sharma, and I'm South Asia Leader for Education at the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, and I'll be your host for this session today. Today's masterclass is on leading digital learning. Delivering online learning in schools is an increasingly necessary skill for teachers. Successful leadership in pivoting to online learning requires the support and facilitation of teachers to develop their identities as learners, designers, and researchers. So in this masterclass, you all as participants will develop skills to collaborate, lead, and establish professional networks required to deliver digital learning effectively. Today's presentation will be for a duration of 1.5 hours, including Q&A session. In addition to ask a question, in order to ask a question, please type your questions in the chat window in the right side of the panel. It has been now shown on the screen to you. Due to capping on number of participants, some of your colleagues are not able to join on WebEx platform. So to provide another option, CBSE is currently streaming live this masterclass on its YouTube channel called CBSE Academic. So please direct your colleagues who are not able to join to this YouTube channel. I'll repeat, the channel's name on YouTube is CBSE Academic. Please be assured that we are recording this webinar and we'll be sharing the recorded version of the session with CBSE to be shared with all of you. During the webinar, the audio quality may fluctuate. In case you have audio-related issues, please check your headset and audio settings, and if the issue still persists, please disconnect and connect back again. In case of any network disruptions, please stay online. You will be reconnected to the webinar in a few minutes. The masterclass you're attending today is second out of 6 masterclasses scoped for CBSE school leaders. Our initiative demonstrates Australia's support to students and educators while we all are grappling with pandemic crisis. In addition to the virtual masterclass series, Australian Trade and Investment Commission has also launched Study with Australia initiative in collaboration with FutureLearn to support your students in experiencing Australian education from the comfort of their home. For more information on these initiatives, you can visit our website or find information through our social media channels. Now I'll introduce the speakers for today. We are having 3 speakers for today's masterclass. Our first speaker is Dr. Christopher Blundell, who is Senior Lecturer, Faculty of Education at Queensland University of Technology in Australia. Christopher teaches units on assessment, digital pedagogies, leadership, and strategic management in faculty's bachelor and master's courses. His current research interests include design-based professional learning, the challenges of integrating digital technologies in teacher practice, and the interaction between digital pedagogies and high-stakes assessment. As an educator, Chris has actively explored through 26 years of school-based teaching practice and 11 years of executive-level school leadership, the place of digital technologies in pedagogy, learning, and assessment. He regularly works nationally and internationally with teachers and school teams on projects focused on innovation in teaching and learning. Our second speaker for the masterclass is Dr. Kate Thompson, who is the Associate Professor of Digital Pedagogies at Queensland University of Technology. Kate's experience comprises research funding totaling approximately $5 million in interdisciplinary research, learning, education technology, evidence-informed practice, and the design and use of new learning spaces. She was the head of Creative Practice Lab at Griffith University for 3 years, where she worked with networks of principals and teachers in leading processes of school change, particularly in relation to introduction of new technology and impacts on learning and pedagogical approaches. Kate is now building a new team at Queensland University of Technology in digital learning for change, that is, working with schools, universities, and industry to implement online learning, virtual reality, e-books, and learning analytics to support learning and teaching. Our third speaker will be Ms. Simone White, who is Professor and Associate Dean for International Engagement at Queensland University of Technology. In the later part of the masterclass, she will be talking to you about professional development courses available at QUT. I will now request our first speaker to please start the presentation, Dr. Christopher Blundell.
Everyone, welcome, and thanks for inviting us into your environments. It's afternoon now here in Australia, and it's good to be part of your day and in India. So today we're going to talk about the idea of leading digital learning, particularly in this era when we've had to move to online and remote learning, and this is true in India and here in Australia. We've only recently had students come back to school, and I think a lot of places we're concerned there might be further waves of COVID-19. So today is really timely, and hopefully you'll find it valuable to you. So just a couple of photos of Kate and myself there. We both work at QUT, and interests are shared around the use of digital technologies in learning and teaching. So we thought we'd start out our session today by just sharing with you some of our experiences from here in Australia when it comes to leading online and remote learning and teaching. So in talking to our colleagues in schools, and for us too, we took all our learning into the online space as part of the COVID-19 response. There are many challenges for school leaders. Those challenges include particularly the very rapid change to a new mode of learning and teaching. And as you know full well, this has led to a change in process and practices that led to quite new ways of doing things for students and teachers. And certainly here, we've gone through a period of disruption when both for students, teachers, and school leaders, those changes have been quite significant. So it's required us all to think very carefully about why we do what we do. One of the complications of that is that the modes of student engagement are more dynamic, and they're hard to predict because the students are working from home. So usually, as you know, when we're working with kids in schools, we understand the school environment. We can reliably predict how things are going to occur for students. But when they're working from home, that's not as easy. And so for your teachers, I'm sure, and for you as leaders, there are some things that you are certainly experiencing at the moment that are very, very unusual. And in addition to that, obviously, we're all going through a process of upskilling, of learning how to do what we do better. And I know for you, and certainly for leaders here, managing teacher workload and balancing parental expectations has been quite difficult as part of this process. So we thought we'd start out by just acknowledging that we're in a very challenging time. And our goal today is to provide you with some ways to think about supporting these processes, particularly around the use of technology for the purposes of learning and teaching. And so we thought we'd probably start by actually explaining a vision that Kate and I share for the role of digital technologies in online and remote learning. So this diagram illustrates that for us. We have at the middle there this idea of learning online and remotely. So this is what your students are doing, but the interface between the teachers and the students is done via digital technology. So where usually you'd be in the classroom together, you might use technology as part of that experience. Now it's the vehicle for connecting. And as you as leaders, your job is to wrap that whole system together, to look at it from the point of view, how do I support the teachers? How do I support the digital technologies? How ultimately, because this is our job, how do we support the students? So we're going to come back to that model at the end of the presentation. But what we really wanted to clarify is that digital technologies have a core role to play for both the students' learning and for the teachers' teaching. And so it's really, really crucial that we think about that role purposefully and we plan for it. So in today's session, we're going to talk about some ways to think about the role of digital technology in learning, and therefore hopefully give some things that you can think about in relation to what you need to do as a leader in this space. Okay, so that's my introduction. I'll be back later. Kate, over to you.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for coming along today. It's going to be a really fun discussion. So I'm starting with understanding really what learning looks like in an online setting, and that's an area I've been doing research on for maybe 15 years now. And to do that, what we're going to do is draw on work that's in Design for Learning. And Design for Learning is really aimed at online learning, mostly with adults, but it's really about providing opportunities for students to learn and being quite flexible in thinking about when they're going to learn. Now, one of the potential problems with shifting this massive shift that we've all done to teaching in this online space is that we also know from the research that teachers use their experience in schools and as teachers to inform their decisions. That helps them make a decision about what to do next in the classroom. But if they are teaching in an online space for the first time, perhaps never even having learned in an online space, that makes that really challenging. So what I'm going to be talking about are some questions that teachers can ask themselves, you can ask yourselves about your students to help start to imagine what it's going to be like for your students to be participating in this online learning for school or remote learning. So I've got sort of 3 areas that I like to ask questions about. It helps me imagine. The research shows that they are interesting things to think about when you think about where the students are sitting. And the first relates to digital learning environments. So what tools and what connectivity do the students have? That could be in terms of their accessibility, in terms of Wi-Fi, in terms of internet access, in terms of bandwidth and speed. So can you assume that all your students are able to access live stream video like we're doing right now? Or is that going to be an issue for some of your teachers' students or your students in your schools? What sort of devices are they going to be engaging with this? Are they going to use their mobile phones? Have they got a laptop? We've got students in Australia where we can think about the entire range within one school, where some students will have no internet access, no screen time, and for those students, the schools have been providing paper-based packs for the families to come and pick up, all the way through to some students who have multiple devices and they can look at something on one screen and they've got multiple screens going and large things. So they're all worth imagining what the possibilities are, and that helps your teachers make decisions about how to then design for the students who are learning remotely and online. Second thing to consider is the physical learning environment. So are your students going to be sitting at a desk, or are they going to be sitting on a beanbag or on the floor somewhere? Are they going to be gathered around the same desk? Are they going to be sharing these devices between people in their family? Are they going to be sitting in a room by themselves with a desk and a lovely setup? Are they going to be doing this in the backyard? All of those other parts of the physical learning environment are really important to consider, because when you have your students in your classroom, they come in the class and all of those things about the digital learning environment and the physical learning environment that helps them realize that they're there to learn. And when they are sitting in their home, potentially on their phone, sitting on the floor, sharing that between members of their family, that's very different, and you're going to need to think about other ways to engage them and prompt them to be ready to learn what they need to learn. And the third one is social interactions. So thinking through whether your students are parts of big families. Now, most of the schools that I've been talking to, that students are part of big families, and so they're sharing their devices, and they're all online at different times. Some students will be communicating with their friends, but some of them won't. And this may be the only time that they interact with you as a teacher, with other adults in their lives, with there's other students in their class, their friends. Again, this is one of the things that if you were in a classroom, your teachers would know what was going on as soon as that class walked in. They would know who's been having an argument during the break. They'd know what the tensions were, and they'd be able to mediate that and help sort it out as part of the class. So when you're thinking about what learning looks like online, all of those things are going on in the background. And so while what the teacher sees on the screen are little answers in a chat or posts to a discussion board or the submission of work in some way, all of those other things are still going on even though they can't see them. And so what we need to think about is how teachers can ask questions to help them understand all of those things that are going on, how they can get that information still to be able to guide their practice. And what I'm going to talk about next are a few examples of tools that I have done research on or have seen and participated in that are just very simple tools that help give teachers some understanding of the learners in that learning environment. So this one here is a very old one, actually. It was part of a project that we did many years ago when I was at the University of Sydney. And what it is a little tool where that circle on the side has all those little coloured dots. And every time someone posted in the chat, like you're all asking questions there, their dot moves closer to the middle. So in the same way as in a classroom, you know who's asking the questions all the time, answering the questions all the time, you know who is participating in the discussions that are going on. When it's in a chat, that's often difficult to monitor because the chats go by very quickly and you lose track of it. And so this little tool not only helped the teacher, but it helped the students in the class understand how other people in the class were participating and whether they were one of those people who was participating a lot or only a little bit. So while that tool's not a common tool in learning management systems now, there are other ways to kind of think about how to keep track of that when your teachers are teaching online. This one is just Google Docs, and it's fantastic for collaborative projects. And one of the reasons that I think it's really good for collaborative projects is that all of those questions that I was raising before about when students would be able to access the online learning, whether they were sharing that on different size screens, whether they were sharing that with different members of their family and the accessibility with different members of their family, this tool lets you engage with the shared work that you're doing, that your students are doing, in their own time. So either synchronously, which Chris is going to talk about in the next section that's coming up. So either at the same time where they're all collaborating on a document, piece of work together, so using chats and comments down the side, or they can do it in their own time. So you still are able to have your students engage in group work regardless of the constraints that there are around their time and their access. It's also really good if you need to get in there and check their work. So there are other platforms that will do this sort of thing through some of the Microsoft products, but the idea that this does not require specific software on their devices. It's accessible online or offline. You can save an offline version. So tools like this that help you engage with what your students are doing, your teachers engage with what your students are doing, as well as the students to engage with each other. And then this one is Yammer. So Yammer looks a little bit like Facebook in the layout. And you could use something like this in a similar way to what you would use a discussion board for, where you post a prompt to question and have people comment underneath. You could similarly use this to help understand how your students are communicating with each other. So this can also be a platform, a way in which students can communicate with each other and catch up. I know my daughter was so happy. She's in year 6, so she's 11. She was so happy when she had opportunities to be able to connect back with the friends who she normally saw during class when we were doing school from home. And because of the way that the Yammer in particular is used, it keeps all of that information together. You can see it very easily. It's very easy for people to pick up, but you can also use it to guide the discussions in your class. So again, it can be almost in real time where students can use it to ask questions if you're online all the time or your teachers are online all the time, but it can also be accessed when people are able to do it. So thinking through all of those different circumstances in which students and teachers might be accessing the online materials. And I think this means I'm going to hand back over to Chris, and he's going to talk to you about teaching online.
Thanks, Kate. So building on what Kate's just talked about, let's talk about what the process of teaching online is like. And Kate mentioned a couple of core ideas that I'm just going to expand on there. Now, as you'd be quite aware, teaching online is different to teaching in a face-to-face classroom, and we would argue it requires some very careful planning. But in order to understand that, it's worth thinking about learning in 2 ways. The first way is which parts of the learning can be done asynchronously. Now, what that means is the students can engage at any time. It means they don't need to be in the same time frame to work together. So, for example, the teacher might set a task, but the students might have a choice about when in the day, in the week, in maybe multiple weeks, they do the activity. So students have more choice, and the advantage of that is it means the students don't have to be with the teacher or under the teacher's direct guidance all the time. So that's asynchronous activities. The other way to look at it is something called synchronous activities, and that's where students are working with the teacher and with each other at the same time. Now, generally speaking, in a classroom context, a lot of what we do is synchronous. The teacher provides instructions, the students work, there's questions and answers, there's guided activity. And that's one of the natural opportunities that comes from being in a classroom and sharing one space. But when we work online, that's not necessarily the case. It's actually quite difficult to work with a class of students synchronously when they're not all in the same room, because it might be affected by things like availability of technology, whether the things are being shared, circumstances at home. So our first big point in terms of planning for online is thinking and suggesting your teachers to think about how much of this learning experience needs to be synchronous. So it's dependent on people being together and learning together, and how much of it can be asynchronous. And deciding between those two really carefully is a really important step in terms of supporting online learning from home. The other key component is just being really clear about what the essential content and learning experiences are. When we're in a classroom with students, we can dynamically respond to what's going on. We can help move the learning forward quite easily as teachers, but from home that's more difficult. And so as a result, there are things that we normally might do in a classroom space that we don't necessarily need to do at home or can't do at home. And so one of the things that we're seeing in schools that are making really good use of these opportunities for students working at home is they're being more conscious about what are the common types of learning experience that students need to do, and then they're matching technology to that experience. And they're picking technology that's available to the students that meets the requirements of the learning experience. And I thought I'd share with you an illustration from a school that I'm working with down in Victoria. So we're in Queensland. This is in Victoria. And this is a document that they created for their teaching staff. And you'll see those two terms there. They've got asynchronous, things where students can work at their own pace, in their own time, and synchronous, where students will work together. And what they've done is identified core learning experiences. So if I just pick the synchronous column for a minute, they're saying online video lessons, pop-up tutorials, large group presentations, and check-in conversations. And so they identified those as being the 4 ways that students would need to be involved synchronously, that's at the same time. And then what you'll notice beside that is the list of icons for the list of software that they have at their school to do that. So for example, they use Microsoft Teams and the Microsoft Suite. And so they've identified Teams as the core tool to do that. And the icon there is the icon for their learning management system. So they would put all the links in the learning management system, but the students would work together and with their teacher using those tools. If you look over on the other side, they have a range of different learning experiences that they would consider asynchronous. So that's when students can work at their own pace, at their own time, and in their own time. And you've got things like blogging, discussion forums, mind mapping, surveys and quizzes, screencasting, task submission and feedback, video creation. And again, what you'll see is rather than say to their teachers, use whatever you can, they provided some specific advice attached to the learning experience. And what they did is they carefully looked at the kind of learning experiences their students would need to do and then linked the technology to that. So that's on screen for you. They gave me permission to share that, but this was their way of moving into the online learning space and supporting everyone in their community. So they also shared this with their families. So the families knew that if the teacher talked about blogging, the students would be using Firefly, so their learning management system, and OneNote to do that. So they appreciated that what they were doing and also helped the parents support their children through these experiences. So the other thing that we're going to suggest today is that in order to work online, there's a certain process that needs to go on in terms of planning for learning. So the model that we're going to share with you is something called the WHO workflow. So this is developed by myself and 2 of my colleagues, Dr. Sean Nyquist and Dr. Michelle Mukherjee. And it's based on our work in schools and observations of teachers who very strategically and intentionally use technology for the purposes of learning. Now, we've been doing this work for a number of years, and we've recently, earlier this year, published a website that's designed to help teachers and school leaders prepare for online learning. So I'll mention the link later on, but it's whoworkflow.com. And I thought I'd take a few minutes now to explain this workflow to you, because it's designed to take a teacher through a series of questions and prompts to purposefully plan for learning, to intentionally plan for learning. So let's just look at those elements now. And you'll see the acronym spells out why, how, and outcomes, and they loop around. So we would argue you start with why, and then move to how, and finally outcomes. And let's just unpack that now. So the why part of it is a teacher deciding what's the purpose of this learning experience. And we don't necessarily mean single lessons, we mean series of lessons. So times when the students might work together individually over a sequence of time and activities to lead to a series of outcomes. And so we're suggesting that the teacher should be quite clear about the purpose of that learning experience and be able to identify the essential objectives and the essential outcomes. As part of this process, this involves empathizing. So going back to Kate's comment about understanding what the learning's like for the students. So that includes things like, how will the students work? How much of this will be synchronous? How much of this will be asynchronous? How much will involve both? And so the teacher needs to envision what's going on. So they have a vision for the learning. And the other thing that we think is really useful there is getting the students to think about how they will be a citizen in this online space, so how they'll be a positive contributor to learning online, how they'll develop and act appropriately in terms of character, how they'll collaborate, think about how they might be creative. We also want to think about critical thinking and problem solving, and obviously we want to think about how the students might communicate. So the why is, why am I doing this? Why am I asking my students to do this? I want to get a vision of what this learning looks like so that I can better plan the how and the outcomes phase. So we sweep around to the how component of the WHO workflow, and this is where we identify how will the students think how will they act and engage, and how will they capture evidence of their learning. Now, in a normal classroom space, as a teacher, you can be moving around the room and you can see how the student's progressing. So that's the convenience of being together in one space. But when the students are learning from home, we've got to think, okay, how do we sort of capture that? And so we suggest there are those three things I thought about. So let me just unpack those for you. The first one is, think means cognitions. Well, how will the students actually engage? How will they go through the processes in terms of their own brains about doing things? Will they be retrieving previous information? Will they be demonstrating understanding? Will they be applying? Will they be critical thinking? So planning for how the students will think is the first step. After that, we then think, well, how will the students act in this learning experience? What will they do as part of this learning experience? And what will that involve? So you might have them, for example, cooking with their families at home and doing some activities around, say, nutritional analysis. So they would be both actively involved in the learning, but using analytical thinking to analyze, let's say the dietary balance of a meal, for example. And the final step is then that idea of, so the students will think, they will act and engage, but how, as part of this process, will they keep a record of their learning? How will they be able to come back and look at it again? And this is where digital technologies really, really help, because assuming they have access to something like a mobile phone or digital technology with a camera, they can be doing a range of different things. So they can be making notes, they can be taking photographs, images, they can be recording audio, they can be recording video and storing that as evidence of their learning, so that at some point they can share that with each other, they can share that with their families, they can share that with the teacher. So the how part is quite practical. It's how will my students work through this learning experience and which technologies will be used as part of that to help and support each of those processes. And again, one of those things we need to do is obviously be aware of what the students have and being conscious about how that might work. And so one of the things that we discovered here in Queensland is that one of the thoughts is that teachers would simply just use video conferencing the whole time to work with students, but they realised that that was often hard with families depending on the amount of data they had for their internet connection at home. As Kate suggests, now if they're all competing for one device. And so it required us to think a little more specifically around how we get the students to think, when and how we get them to act and engage, and how they capture evidence learning so that they can come back. The final part of the WHO workflow is about the outcomes. So this is where the teacher thinks, what will the students achieve as part of this process? And in particular, finds ways to make it clear so the students can actually monitor their own progress. Again, in a classroom, you can wander around the room and give the students some immediate feedback, let them know how they're progressing towards a goal. But when they're working from home, they have to have a sense for themselves about how they're progressing in the end. So we've got to think about, how do the students monitor their progress? How do they link the evidence of what they've done back to the essential objectives and outcomes of that learning experience? And we also think about it from the point of view of how they share that with you. So as a teacher, how does that information come back? And so one of the things that we're seeing is the students are collecting a range of evidence and they're drawing together the key points to show to their teacher what they can do. The other thing, obviously, that digital technologies can do is things like quiz applications that allow the students to respond to quizzes that either can be marked by the computer or the teacher, or at least get that data to the teacher. As Kate mentioned, the other thing that's really important is social interaction. And so one of the other things we build in there is the idea of actually monitoring the students' well-being. How are they going? Now, again, we know in a classroom, if a student's experiencing a challenge, a teacher can work with them, help them to understand that challenge, and also comfort them if they're a bit upset by it. But again, online, that's more difficult. So we've got to think about a way to do that. And the other thing that's really important is, how do we get the students to reflect on their learning? And just as importantly, how do they reflect on their learning back to the teacher? So Caulfield Grammar, the schools that I shared that information from before, one of the things that they've been doing is getting their teachers to ask the students, how was this learning experience? And just as part of the conversation as a wrap up, either via a video conference, an audio chat, or a text-based chat, and ask students, what was that like? And they've used that to fine-tune. So from our point of view, the Who workflow is a really useful model for guiding the planning, the purposeful planning of learning in an online space. And it importantly doesn't start with the technology, it starts with the learning, and that leads to selection of strategies and technologies that might help with that. So that's the Who workflow. We thought we'd mention it because we think it's a really powerful tool, and certainly the feedback that we've received so far is that it's been a really good way for teachers and school leaders to focus students and focus planning on students and focus teachers' processes on those things. So if you'd like more information, the website is just whoworkflow.com. It's freely available. On that, you'll have a more detailed explanation of how the workflow works. We've included on it some summaries and some prompt sheets. So there's a downloadable summary that can be used for reflection. There's a prompt sheet with a series of questions that are designed to help teachers in the first phase of using it. And there was also a couple of examples of some planning templates from a range of different year levels, from primary school, secondary, and university level. So I encourage you to use that. That's, again, freely available to you, so please afford yourself with that. And I thought I'd just introduce a couple of tips or a couple of things that are worth thinking about as part of this process too. So the first tip is, in addition to thinking about all the curriculum and assessment-based outcomes that we need to achieve, one of the other things that's really, really important is finding ways to maintain a sense of community. And certainly based on what I'm observing for schools that appear to be doing it well, often they do that with non-curriculum and non-accessible activities. So my nephew is at a school, and to get the students involved in physical activity, they were doing push-up challenges. And so they're doing various physical challenges that were just for the purpose of creating a community, a bit of competition, but also some healthy body movement. So think about it from the point of view of how your students maintain those connections and what you can do to make it easy for them to be involved with that. And by not making it about curriculum or assessment, you're just saying it's okay to be involved with that. As I said before, it's really important to encourage the teachers to seek feedback from their students. It's actually really, really hard to predict what every situation is like. And so by asking for feedback, it helps teachers to empathise with the students, what it's like for them learning from home, and to then use that to shape future learning experiences. The last one is really important, and I'm sure that you are thinking about this already, is during this period of time, your teachers are discovering new ways to do this. They're discovering ways to improve what they're doing, and over the many weeks, they've probably got better at it. So obviously one of the things that we want to do is encourage our teachers to share that, to share their practices with each other, to share their discoveries. We'd probably describe this as something called a community of practice. So we'd really encourage you, as we do with all teachers and all school leaders, get your teachers talking to each other. And often teachers in Australia, at least, are a bit embarrassed about sharing what they're thinking because they think, oh, this isn't anything exciting. But often it's just a new discovery or a new idea that either someone can copy or that idea triggers another idea. And so really, really important that we do what we can to support our teachers to learn from and with each other. Okay, Kate, over to you.
Right, I'm back. And what I'm going to talk about next is professional learning. And that really connects to what Chris was just talking about. And we both have very similar approaches. We both work with schools or sometimes networks of schools. And we have really similar approaches to how we will engage with professional learning of teachers and principals. So I'm just going to talk to you about two examples from some of the work that I've been involved with to give you a sense of some of the things that we think are important, like Chris was just talking about, to really lead that process within your school and to support your teachers. So this first one, I worked with probably 40 or 50 teachers from all different schools around Brisbane here in Australia, and we were looking at evidence or research or data-informed teaching. And what we had happen was we had some invited academics who would give a small talk and really some of the cutting-edge research in the area of technologies education, because we had a brand new technologies curriculum come in. And then we had the teachers collaborating with each other to design assessment that would let them collect the data and the information that they needed to inform the decisions that they were making in their class. And we were really asking them to push the idea of what sort of data they could collect and the way that students could, those things that Chris was just talking about with the WHO workflow, the ways that students could demonstrate and provide evidence of their learning. So and that went for 2 days. So we had them come back the second day. We had a lot of guest speakers, but we also left a lot of time in there for the teachers to be able to talk to each other. And I think the elements that were really important from that we learned from that was it's really about building a relationship with the teachers that we worked with, who we worked with, and the teachers who came along. I'd been working with in different schools around the place, just one-on-one for probably at least 6 months. And it was just exactly what Chris had said. They all had these questions that they thought were silly questions, but they were common questions in every single school about the changes that they were implementing in their school in relation to shifts in technology. And all I kept saying was, you should really go talk to this teacher in this other school, because they've just had the same problem and they've figured out a solution that works for their context. But I think one of the big take-homes is that there's no one right solution here. There are lots of different solutions that work for your particular school and your teachers and your students. And so understanding how other teachers and schools have made the decision helps you make the decisions that you need to for your school. The other really interesting take-home from this was it was really important for teachers to collaborate with teachers outside their own school, because they got ideas from different contexts. They met new people who they could keep in contact with, but they also, because they had to explain their own context, it helped them in their own school, it helped them understand it just a little bit better because they had to explain it to new people. And the third thing that I think is really important in professional learning is to give the teachers enough time. So we had them for 2 days, and I love working with teachers so much. They have such fantastic ideas. They love teaching, and once you give them enough time away from school to have their ideas and think about how they're going to work them all the way through, they have such a great time because they're engaged in this really creative work. That is why they usually got into the job in the first place. So the other example I wanted to tell you about was a network of schools that I've been working with in Canberra, so towards the south of Australia, and that's 6 or 7 schools I've been working with for probably 4 years now. And we go down, it's a similar model, we go down to Canberra and we do a guest speaker, and the school that's hosting us presents some information about their school, and then they engage in a design task that is something to do with shifting practice, to do with collaboration or technology, or something to do with learning spaces. And for them, we have these cards that help them make sense of what's going on in their school. And we've recently developed an online tool to be able to do the same thing, so we don't have to be there with these actual physical cards, which I thought might be of interest for you all. But one of the really cool things about this particular group is that the principals come along. So we know, and the teachers know who are there. So again, we mix them up between schools, so they don't stick in their own school groups, but they know that their principals are really supporting the changes that they're proposing and the ways that they're proposing to move forward with particular problems or ideas that they have. and the principals really understand what problems the teachers are having, and understand the whole process they've gone through to be able to come up with the ideas. And I think it's been really important for those teachers to see that leadership within the school and have the principals all engaged in that process. And the other really important thing from this particular professional learning experience is that the design tasks that we ask them to do each time are tied really clearly to problems that they are all facing in their schools. So because we've built up this relationship with the teachers and the principals, we understand the school context. So it's a generic enough problem so that it doesn't matter which school they're going to, that they're from, they can engage with this and apply it in their own school context. But it's not only specific to one school. And that's been really interesting for, I think, the teachers to see how some of those problems are common across different schools and very different school contexts, from primary all the way up to year 11 and 12. So that's just a little insight into some of the ways that, and I know that Chris, when he works with teachers and principals, it's that really long-term relationship where the principals are engaged, and it's a commitment to a whole school change, or at least part of the school changing, often in relation to technology. So we've just got some final thoughts because it's almost at the end of our time. So thank you for very patiently listening, and then I'll be handing over to Simone. So this is what we started off with in the beginning, where what we wanted to talk to you about was this online learning and this change that you're all going through and managing and needing to lead. And learning really is at the core of it. And what I was talking about was really imagining what your students are going through and are managing in order to engage with learning. Then we think about how it is that we can support that with technology. And sometimes that technology is digital and sometimes it is with pieces of paper, but we're supporting that learning with some tools, and then with our practice as teachers, and then you as principals are supporting that with that school leadership. And I guess some of the take-home messages from what we were talking about today are that there isn't just one right answer. Every school is different. You have different teachers, different students, very different contexts, and you as school leaders know that school best. But taking your teachers through a process is the really important thing, and that your teachers are going to need time to engage and have ideas and try things out and ask questions, and enough time to make adjustments and a bit of flexibility to be able to make adjustments. And some things just aren't going to work the first time. They're going to take some practice. So thank you so much for having us today. I'm going to hand over to Simone. I'm going to keep control of the slides though. And I hope you have a good rest of your morning.
Thank you, Kate, and hello everyone. Warm greetings for your day, and it's wonderful to be with you. I hope that you learned a lot. I'm sure you did learn a lot from both Kate and Chris, and I could see some of the questions and comments coming through, and yes, we're more than happy to provide the presentation. In a moment, we're going to give you some time for some questions and answers as well, so you'll have a bit of a chance for some discussion. But I thought we would take a little bit of an opportunity to share with you a little bit more about the Faculty of Education at QUT, and a little bit more about the types of professional development that you might like to engage with. So thank you, Kate. If you could go to the next slide. I'm not sure if the next slide is coming. There it is. So as Chris outlined in that WHO flow chart, it was for free. So people can go online and have a look at that. And our faculty has recently, actually because of so many of our teachers and principals having to teach and to learn remotely with their students, we decided to put a lot of our activities, our games and our resources online for them. And so we encourage you as well to go to our website. There is a whole wealth of free professional development that we have found very helpful for our Australian teachers, and we welcome the opportunity for you to engage with them as well. So you'll find out lots of different activities and ideas. Thank you, Kate. If you could go to the next slide. Something else that we thought that you might like to know about, again, this is for free, and it's our class. It's our podcast, but we call it Class, our Class series. And we have so far, this is our second, we've had 2 series launched. Many of our academics are sharing about all sorts of different topics. So actually our own Dr. Chris Blundell most recently did a podcast. It's about a 40-minute audio, so you can just listen at your own leisure. Often our teachers are engaging with the podcast when it's, in the afternoon or on a weekend having a walk, and they listen to it. And Chris was actually sharing about education in the digital age. And it was launched just around March when COVID was really sort of impacting on all our schools and our teachers and our leaders. And one of the teachers responded it was the godsend. So you'll see some of the other topics there. And we know that you're more secondary school principals, but there are for all ages and particular, areas of interest. So, for example, a particular one about how to build friendships for young children, how to use art education, how to help students take better control of their own learning. So again, we just wanted to share with you some of the free material that you might like to learn and engage with. Thank you, Kate. If you could just go to the next slide. Another thing we thought we'd share with you is something we've developed that is fully online. So just like in terms of going all our schools, we've gone fully online with what we call micro-learning. So for us in Australia, and perhaps for you in India, many of our teachers are so busy with their own profession, with their own learning for their students and supporting their students, that their own professional learning takes a back seat. And so what we've tried to do, a bit like this masterclass actually, have a bit of a bite-sized learning, something that's manageable. And we've created a pathway for teachers, if they so choose, to build up their learning and their certification. So I could see people saying, will you get a certificate for this participation? And I could see yes was the response. And likewise, we've built up smaller bite-sized learning for people. And this is open not only to our Australian teachers, but teachers all around the world who have started studying and learning with us. So if you like some of the things that you've learned today, you can participate in one of our free MOOCs. So these are a 2-hour equivalent of a professional learning. As I said, it's all for free and gives you a bit of a taste. Do I want to learn more? You can see there some of the topics that we have created, and they might be something that you would like to consider. One of the very popular topics at the moment actually is creating apps in the classroom. So that's in line, particularly at the moment, in terms of the move to remote learning. People can then, if they wish, do a module, which is equivalent of like a 2-day professional development, but they do it all online and at their own pace, as Chris said, in an asynchronous way, and they get a certificate for that. And then if they wish, and they want to think about doing a further study, they can do what we call a Module Plus, which has an assessment component. And then if they pass, they can use that to bundle as what we call a 6th credit point into our graduate certificate. So what we've found, this model is working for teachers. It provides the time that Kate was talking about, the space, the community of practice that Chris was talking about, a way to work with others, but also to work in your own time, in your own way. That means that you can still spend time with your family and focus on your classroom and your colleagues, etc. So we thought we would share that as another taste for you to learn about, but also as an interesting model for you to think about how you help your students structure their learning as we move into this remote learning, this fully online learning situation. And just finally, the last slide, please, Kate. So you can see here, I was talking to you about what we call the micro-credentials, the sort of more modularized learning. We also have our professional development for people like yourselves, esteemed leaders, who wish to get a qualification as a postgraduate study. So we have a graduate certificate in a range of different topics. One of those, as you can see there, is leadership. And another one is on digital learning. So STEM is there as well as TESOL and inclusive education. So they're just some topics that you might be thinking about. So really what we wanted to share with you, and I hope that you have found from both Kate and Chris, we have a wonderful wealth of expertise. We have lots of opportunities for you to learn, and we're very keen to learn from you as well. And then you can stagger your professional development with us if you wish. But I think what might be timely now is I'm going to ask our hosts to see if we can have a bit of a question and answer, because Chris and Kate are more than happy to answer any specific questions that you might have. So I'll hand over to the hosts now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simone. And thanks to Kate and Christopher as well for a very insightful presentation. We are now moving to Q&A segment of the masterclass and are requesting the participants to ask their questions on the right-hand side on the comments box. In order to ask a question, you simply need to type your questions in the chat window, and we'll be kind of picking up the questions from there. While the questions are coming through, Kate and Chris, a quick question, looking at the macro level things here in the market. Last week I was attending a session with one of India's leading think tank, and there was a discussion on emergency learning surge. Now we all know that there is surge of online education across the globe, including India. So what particular model do you suggest for school leaders to ensure that the approach towards the students is more learner-centric, and how they can design and conduct the online courses in an effective way?
That's a really
go, Kate.
that's enormous. I think it will kind of depend on within Australia, each state is responsible for education, and each state has pretty much used a different platform for it. So it's very hard to sort of say this is the one best approach, because depending on what platform you're using and depending on the accessibility and the particular circumstances of the families where your students are, that's all going to impact on that, the way that you do that design thing. But I think if what you have is enough time for your teachers and principals to really play with whatever it is that they're being given to use, and then think about how they're going to be able to adapt it to their circumstances, I think that's going to be the best way to go there, the most efficient way to go to get learning to all of the kids who need it and get those resources there.
The thing that maybe I'd add to that is that and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but for software companies, this is a great opportunity. And so every company will be offering their tool as the tool that works. And that's why we talk about the Who workflow and being really intentional, because in the end, it's very easy to be kind of impressed by the features, the really nice elements of something, what we call the bells and whistles, all the things that make it really attractive. But it actually, from an education point of view, and because you've got a network of schools, actually being kind of clear about what you really want from something and pick the tool that delivers those things, and this is important, reliably, but isn't necessarily dependent on having massively high levels of bandwidth. Some tools need huge amounts of data and bandwidth, and so not getting too caught up in the bells and whistles, but being really intentional. Here are the kind of core things we'd like this tool to do. And Kate mentioned a range of, or we've both mentioned a range of tools. I mean, there are some tools that are free, and that's always a good place to start, because at least you've got access to something you can explore and start looking at what's going on. And as Kate say, have a bit of a play.
And I would just also pick up on that and say, sometimes the tools are free because they're collecting a lot of data about your students and your teachers and your school. So really being aware of the privacy policies of the companies and the long-term subscription fine print in all of their terms and conditions is really important as well.
Thanks, Kate and Chris. Now we have many questions coming in. Numerous questions out there. I really have to put these questions into themes. So the first theme which I want to talk to you about, again, all of our school leaders, they're very knowledgeable and they want to ask the question which are kind of out of the box. So the first question which is coming in is, how can school leaders add practical knowledge into the online learning to enable effective learning?
Just define for us what practical knowledge is, just so we know.
So when, here in the schools, you have theory, which is kind of going in the classes, and then you have some work in the laboratories as well. Now, we do know that the students cannot go and attend the labs, how we can utilize online medium to kind of provide that practical knowledge to the kids as well. Sure.
I've seen, I'll jump in if you don't mind, Chris. I've seen a bunch of really interesting resources that are available out there. So there are websites, and I'm happy to share a few afterwards if there's some follow-up. There are websites that let you access, say, different environments in the world and look at the data that's being collected and do that sort of biology fieldwork stuff. There are online virtual labs where you can go through some of those inquiry processes as far as doing, say, a chemistry experiment. I've seen one that's about genetics as well. And there are also things like Tinkercad and platforms like that where you can do that technologies, programming, robotics type work in an online environment as well. They're all free for the most part. They're free. They're websites, and it means that if you structure the lesson around it, you can actually have students participating in some of those practical skills. It's not exactly the same as if they're using their hands and doing those experiments, but you can have them think about the decisions that they would have to make. And so you get some of the way towards that inquiry process and the thinking skills that they need to engage in those different discipline areas.
The other thing I'd add to that, which I think builds on what Kate's saying, is when we think about how students think, we can then sort of say what is very much dependent on a piece of equipment and target that. But sometimes it's actually not so much about the equipment, it's actually about how we think or the skill. And so, one of the things that we talk about a little bit is the idea of teaching chemistry. So while it's not the same necessarily as certain particular processes of chemistry in a lab, you can still do a great deal of things from home with reasonably available materials. And so making decisions about what's appropriate and thinking about it from the point of view of, if we're talking about inquiry, how much of that inquiry is dependent on a particular piece of equipment, how much of it could we do with something else? And even, I'd argue, it's actually really helpful if you've got older kids to actually say to them, if we're here, this is what we do, but we're not. And so you actually problem solve how to do that learning experience with them so they can do it at home.
I've also seen a great resource, or heard about a great resource that some people over in our School of Science and Engineering created when they had to move their teaching online just recently, and they produced a number of videos so that the teaching staff there were still allowed in the labs, and they produced a series of videos that was like a choose your own adventure. So at this step, and the students would say, now I think you should do this thing next. And so the experiment could actually go wrong. They could learn that they'd chosen the wrong series because there was a little video for each possible step that they could take. And then they could go back to the beginning and try again. And so they could learn that things could go wrong. They weren't just watching something, they were making the decisions, and they could see the consequences of those decisions without doing the activity themselves. So no blowing anything up at home.
Thanks, both. Before we move to the next question, I'm looking at numerous comments again, asking what tools should we utilize? Can you please list the tools again? So I would like to let the participants know that you are going to receive a copy of this session's recording. and probably you can again go through all the video to have a look at what tools were described and note it down as well. We have to move to the strategic questions here. So the next question for both the speakers is, what is the authentic way to test students online, which means ensuring that when they're taking the test, they aren't helped by the family member or friend?
Yeah.
Hard question. I'd probably answer that question with a question, unfortunately. And my question is, when are tests an absolute necessity, as opposed to when are they just what we use because that's what we've always done? And so, to me, this move to online, which we had none of us had any control over, means we do actually need to question the things that we'd otherwise used to think were just how things were done. Because to be fair and open and honest about it, the risk of cheating on test-based assessment does increase if there's a family member who really wants their child to do well because the result is important. So we would certainly encourage, because there is no right answer to this, but we think that one of the lines through this is to say, when is it absolutely necessary to do a test? Are there other ways to do this? Are there other ways for students to demonstrate their learning? And that's the thing that's actually worth exploring, because in the end, that hopefully minimises the number of times you need to use tests, and then you're only focusing on a smaller problem, not a huge problem. But if it's a focused problem, then you can work as teams to find solutions. Now, there are many ways it's done. None of them I think are particularly great, but there's, students sit in front of their computer while, it's on video conference, and the teacher can just check in to see that, what's going on. So there are ways to do it. None of them are ideal because it's just not easy. We've had the same situation at QUT where the exams had to be done from home. And that's led a few people to ask the question, well, why are we doing exams?
Right. Thanks. I'll move to the next question, and we'll take a question from regional India. Numerous questions out there, again, for, the accessibility to internet or the speed of internet as well. So I'll kind of reword the question. When we know that in the regional areas there is going to be low bandwidth and the teachers are using the tools like WhatsApp and other social media tools, how can we kind of minimize the whole file size to ensure that students get the information in small bites and they're able to work through them?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a problem here as well. There are lots of families in some communities that don't have access. They don't have internet access at all, and so schools were dealing with it in a variety of ways. So I know one school was communicating with parents and just saying, if you have internet access and a device, here's the link, here's all of the ways that you're going to be able to access the materials. If you have a device but no internet access, come in and grab a USB with all the information, all of the materials on it. And if you have no device and no internet access, then here is a paper version of all of the materials. So when they were designing the materials, they needed to account for all of those different ways that students would be able to access them. So I think part of it is about thinking that all the way through, and then thinking it's a bit like the assessment. So what is it that you're actually wanting students to learn? So most of the teaching I do involves group work, involves students creating things. And so if they can communicate via WhatsApp doing that planning, and they can learn how to distribute the different tasks that they have amongst different group members and take advantage of who has access to what in that way, then they start to manage their group work and manage their learning in a way that accounts for all of the different resources available to all of them, and then they can join back together and still learn from each other because they've had access to different things.
and Chris. The next question is about, comparison between online and face-to-face learning. So the questions are about delivering values-based learning, delivering, helping the students to socialize with other students, and numerous other things as well. So the basic question here is how we can ensure that the connect between the teacher and students is stronger, and also the peer connect between the students, is more sociable, social in a way, so that there is integrated learning in terms of both the hard skills but also the social skills which they need to pick up from school.
Do you want to run with that, Kate, or want me to?
I can have a first go.
Yep.
I have seen lots of good examples of this. I think you need to plan for students to still be able to engage in those incidental meetings and those incidental conversations. So if you are planning for some time when everyone's online at the same time, then some of that time just needs to be catching up. And I know one of the best examples was my daughter's class. So year 6, and her teacher organised for half an hour at the same time every day, and that was when the class caught up. So she wasn't doing any teaching then, and forever my daughter was going and finding the cat because they all had to share what their pet looked like and hold it up in the video in front of the camera. And so it just meant that they could keep those connections going between class members, and that also kind of kept that connection with the teacher too, because they're so happy to be able to see her. But if you don't have that sort of accessibility, then using those WhatsApp groups for that, really creating some of those tasks that mean that students have to connect. And so maybe one of the tasks that you might set them is about, sharing things that have happened, sharing things about their homes and their families and what's been happening during lockdown or what they're looking forward to about when it finishes. Just giving them lots of opportunities to share and building that into the way that the classes and the learning is structured.
Definitely, that's all good. I think just to add to what Kate's saying, when we're together on a school campus, there are times of the day during breaks where the students interact socially, so we don't have to plan for it as much. Whereas now, we actually need to build that into the timetable. So when you have a schedule for the week or multiple weeks, you have time just to sort of catch up. And that can, that might be via video, that might be via voice chat, it might be via text chat. So you can look at different levels of what that interaction looks like. The other thing in terms of the question around values education is I would, and we've got a couple of schools here that are doing this as part of what they do anyway, but getting the students to connect with their local community as much as possible, but also safely, obviously, in terms of COVID-19, but how they actually enact values. So how they actually, if the teacher sets up a scenario that is about values and a values education-based project, and then the students enacting that with maybe their family, with the people nearby that they're allowed to interact with. So actually do a real-world values engagement and then capture evidence of that in whatever form, a photograph, a letter from someone saying, thanks, here's what you did, all those sort of things that they can then use to share back with their friends. I did this for my parents and this is what I learned from doing it, for example.
Thanks, Chris. Now the next question is, pertaining to health issues. So we all know that increased screen time may be harmful to the students. So how we can ensure that students, although they need to spend a lot of time in front of the screen, but they also keep themselves healthy, but they are not on the classes.
Look, the way that they've handled that in certainly schools around Queensland with primary schools is that they've still had the PE teacher has been setting things for them to do while they're at home. So it could be setting up an obstacle course in their backyard, or it could be one of them was like an online video where they had to do some dancing. So there are loads of ways that the kids were being asked to jump up and down, but and move around and be away from the screen, and then report back on it. But I tend to agree, it's exhausting sitting on your screen all day. I know when we've been working from home, and So I think it's important, as much as those social interactions are planned for, that you also plan for them to do things where they have to look like out into the world outside as well, and not just be focused in on a screen, particularly if they're looking at their mobiles. Those are small screens, and that's a lot to sort of look down on all the time. And really thinking through things like font size and the different options for how they're going to be engaging with it, and making it as easy as possible for them to not have to squint and sit very still for a really long time.
And I think the assumption with a lot of the screen time language is the students are just staring at a screen, absorbing. So if we pivot that round to they are using all the things at their disposal to complete an activity. If the activity is designed to kind of, might involve paper, it might involve movement, it might involve talking to other people, and so we design in movement. So it's not the technology is not only about input; it's about creating and doing and thinking, and all technologies. That's paper and pens too, obviously. So being really intentional about increasing variety in the student's experience.
Thanks, both. I think that the next question would be relevant to many of the participants here. So the question is, we tried everything to make our online classes, providing fun environment, but still, we think that we are falling short to motivate students to join the classes. So any tips on that?
Yeah, we found the same thing. Look, my go-to is always to tie some of the assessment to actual participation, but we're not allowed to do that here anymore. That used to work really well back when I was at Sydney Uni. So that was, if that's an option, then you make part of the participation in the class and part of the assessment based on something that they had to do or say in class, and they're reporting back on that. So that's one of those sort of sneaky ways to do it. But to actually get the engagement going in that class, I tend to think it's really hard, and the students are just really tired. I know, like, when I talk to any kids around, and when I talk to our students, as much as this is an overwhelming time of change for us, it is for them as well. And I think we can all be a little bit kind to ourselves as far as how far our abilities to motivate people to do things are able to go. Apart from that, it's very similar to in an actual classroom. It's about setting some of those rules. It's about being engaging with what you're doing. It's about understanding your students' context and trying to adjust. If there are things that you're doing that is just not working for them, involve the students maybe in having some input into what you're doing next in your class, so that you can help figure out how what you are imagining is going to be working in an online space could be changed just a little bit. It's often just some little tweaks.
Right.
I think I'd add to that by just saying, giving, as Kate says, we'd use the phrase giving students some authorship. So if you say, look, here's the learning goal, here are the things that we need to achieve through this learning experience, and involving the students in what that might look like. So if the first part of the learning activity is actually, we need to achieve these things, how might we do it? So the students have some input with it. There's also a degree of pride where they come back and say, I know, here are the 4 things we set out to do. Here's my way of doing it. So they get to share with enthusiasm their contribution. So they feel valued out of that. So it's one of the ways to achieve it.
Yeah, having them set up the rules of the online space, if you are able to meet all at the same time. I sometimes do that in the physical spaces as well. So bring them in, and everyone gets to have an opportunity to say what they think the learning should look like in that space. And so that sets the tone for, well, this is what we expect, this is how we're all going to act when we're in here. And that means everyone needs to participate, and that means all of those things.
Thank you. The next question is about receiving support from the parents at home. Now we know that due to pandemic, many of the parents are working from home, but due to their jobs, they are busy from morning till evening. So how do you think we can get support in an effective way, which is not counterproductive to them, and also adds value to the kids' learning.
Look, I think there's a couple of things that I've seen that I think are really good practice. What we've observed over here in Australia is this conversation started up about the parents being teachers now. And everyone in education here in Australia was quite concerned about that language because these kids still have teachers, they're just not in the same space as each other anymore. So a big part of it, I think, is actually around the communication that school leaders have and teachers have with the families that sort of says, here is how we're going to do this, here is how you can help, but please don't think that you're teaching the students. That's still the teacher's job, that's still the school's role with that. So really carefully managing expectations with that because like teachers, Kate mentioned before that as teachers we tend to use our prior experience to understand what's happening now, and so we're all pretty uncomfortable because our prior experience is face-to-face and we're now all online. It's the same for parents. They're comparing this experience to their own school experience and they're seeing the difference. So actually helping parents to understand, yes, this is different, but here's how we're responding. This is the help that we might need from you, but not getting the parents to think that they are teaching their kids the whole time. And to be fair, it will take a while for that to be worked out. It'll take a while for schools to work out how it works for them, and everyone needs to be okay with, we haven't got the solution now. We need to be okay about working away at fine-tuning a solution and letting the parents know we're working on it. We want your feedback, but it's not something that solves straight away because, to my knowledge, no one's got this completely right yet because it's just so new. And we need to give ourselves permission to kind of be okay about that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I've just handled that myself, and my youngest is only 6 years old. So that was not an age where he could just do self-guided learning. And so he needed a lot of adult help with the school work while I was trying to do my normal work from home. And one of the interesting things I think that school did was they understood that for that school, most of the families had two parents who were working. And so they were assuming that most parents wouldn't be able to help kids during weekdays, and with the very little kids, it's no good helping them in after normal work hours because they're too tired. So they were anticipating that a lot of this schoolwork was going to be done on the weekend. So they were sort of designing it in ways where you could pick it up and do some of these bigger, sort of more inquiry projects and things that you could do on the weekend for a couple of hours that was almost like a play type activity that you would do with your child, but that connected back to the curriculum. So there are ways to, again, think about their home context and think, well, when are some other opportunities for them to learn? And they might not be able to participate in all of the schoolwork during normal school hours, but if we can intrude on family life just a little bit more, maybe on the weekends, then we can think about how to work within what the family needs in order to function.
Thank you. Now we are moving to the last segment of Q&A section. I'll only choose 3 questions, and again, I'll try to put all the questions in theme so that we are more strategic in answering. So the very first question which we are kind of picking up is about mental health of teachers. Having teachers as the biggest connect between the school and the students, we know that they are under tremendous work assignments where they have to first create content, put it online, run the classes, and also making sure that all the students attend the classes. We do understand that it creates some stressful time or stressful issues for the teachers. So how can the school leaders ensure that they are managing the mental health issues for those teachers in this stressful time?
I'll probably have a couple of suggestions with that. The first one is, this is such a big change that teachers shouldn't be working on their own with this. So working together, sharing the workload in terms of developing resources and finding new ways to do things is really, really important. It makes sense that If an individual teacher is doing all of that, that's a really serious risk to that particular teacher's well-being. So developing teams and allowing those teams to work together, helping them to work together, to share what they're doing with each other and everybody else is really, really important. And the other thing as school leaders is that we need to acknowledge a couple of things, in my view. One, there is no silver bullet. But what that I mean is there is no one way to do this. There is no perfect answer. So we need to be okay with, we will find ways that work for now, and they might need to be improved over time. And the other thing is to sort of be really strategic as a leader and say, which things must we prioritise first and get those working well? Which things do we need to push back a little bit to give our teachers some room to build confidence, build their competence with what's going on, and develop that culture of collaboration and sharing? Once that culture is developed, then we can move probably not more efficiently necessarily, but we can certainly move better and with more confidence towards where we'd like to go in terms of other changes. So that's what I'd suggest in that space.
Yeah, and I'd probably just add to that, in much the same way we've been talking about the students, thinking through what access your teachers have to the internet, what sort of devices they have, what support they might need, and that it's another group of people who might not be totally comfortable with saying, no, I'm going to have to teach sitting at my dining table with all my kids around me. I know plenty of teachers I've spoken to who are also juggling their work from home, which is teaching, while their kids are participating in online and remote learning all at the same time, and trying to juggle all of that. And I think the teachers who I've spoken to who have found it stressful but manageable had principals who were checking in on them regularly, or checking in with them regularly. So they were making sure they understood their particular home and health contexts and what concerns they might have. They were asking about what further support they needed, links to resources. They were helping find, doing that some of that troubleshooting work, and really just understanding each individual teacher, because like we've been saying, it's such a big change and teachers haven't had experience in this, and some teachers will pick up the technology and just run with it and create all of this wonderful stuff, and other teachers will just be so scared of all of these new things and so scared it's going to fail. And so each teacher needed different types of support with going through this change. So I think that those examples where I've seen it's worked the best.
Thanks, Kate. We have a final question for you, but before we come to that, I have a question coming up for Simon. Simon, you were talking about professional courses for school leaders. So out of all the courses which you're having, which one is the most valuable for the school leaders in this pandemic crisis?
Well, that's a hard question. I think it's a little bit like what Chris has just been saying. There is no one size fits all, because it really depends on the school principal, their school context, and also the community needs. So I can't just choose one, I'm sorry to say. I think it really depends on what your needs are. But I did see some questions about inclusive education, and because that is something we haven't really talked about, is the diversity of how we can help our students in helping all our students in our diverse learners. And I think inclusive education is a particular one that I know our Australian principals are really looking at, and perhaps in India too. But really, I can only recommend all our studies and encourage people. We will look to see how we can, with Austrade, to share all of the material so everybody can see and choose the right pathway for themselves. So I hope that helps.
Thanks, Simon. We'll definitely pass on the information to all the participants. Now, coming back to the final question, which is very much tied to the first question, Kate and Chris. In the first question, we were discussing surge in online learning and the emergency response which the schools and the teachers have to, kind of provide there. So the question is, what is the future of online learning?
You want to take that, Kate? You want me to?
No, I can take that. Because so I was just writing something about this in the last week or so. One of the big barriers to any implementation of technology in education is the uptake by teachers, and for teachers to see the value to learning for their students. And we have this, for awful reasons, we have this situation where everyone has just shifted. The biggest barrier that we've had to changing practice is just overcome, and people are actually adopting these. So I really see the future of online learning is not as something that you would use all of the time, but now that those barriers have been overcome, it can be something that can be used to enhance and be part of the suite of tools that teachers can use to keep connected to with their students in times outside of school, for students to be okay with being able to access resources and access expertise, and really enhance the good practice that has been going on in classrooms already.
I'd agree. I think down the track, I don't think Kate and I would ever think that everything would be entirely online learning experience. There's just so much value in the face-to-face learning dynamic in schools and classrooms. But there are many opportunities that, things we can learn now might actually be really beneficial down the track. And we get the question, what's really valuable, but only in a face-to-face environment, what might be done as well as that in an online space, and making, again, those really strategic decisions. What's the best for the kids, and designing for that. So we get a chance to kind of revisit some of the assumptions we've held for a very long period of time.
Thank you. Very, very insightful session, and good answers to the questions. We'll definitely pass on all the recording to the participants. Now, I would like to wrap up by thanking definitely our speakers, Dr. Thompson and Dr. Christopher Blundell, and also Ms. Simone White, for your time and sharing your insights with the participants in the masterclass. I would also like to thank our colleagues from Queensland University of Technology, whose name were not taken, but I'm very sure that they tried their best to put it all together. And finally, acknowledge my colleague Neha, who has been behind organizing this masterclass. I'm sure that all participants have enjoyed the session. I thank all the participants for your time and questions. As have been mentioned before, the recording of the webinar will be shared with CBSE and with you as well for your reference. And a number of comments were about the certificates. So can I please tell you that there is one certificate per person per session, but you will be receiving the certificates after all the sessions have been delivered, and you need to be in touch with CBSE for that. Now, I'm going to wrap up this session. Thank you all, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks.
Thank you.